Hello everyone! Welcome back to Pass the Aux Chord, and welcome to a brand new series called Album of the Day. A pretty self-explanatory thing here. Every day I'm going to be coming on here and giving you a suggestion, recommendation, and speaking about an album that I find interesting. If you've been here a while, first of all, thank you. Second of all, there is a little bit of a more off-the-script moment where I'm just giving a little bit of updates and things right at the end of this video, so you can just use the timestamps, probably watch it first, I don't know, just skip over there and then skip back if you want to. Queens of the Stone Age are a Seattle, Washington-based hard rock and alternative rock band, mostly led by vocalist, frontman, guitarist, founder Josh Homme. Aside from Homme himself, there has been somewhat of a revolving door of members coming in and out throughout the years. That all changed in 2013 with the release of what some consider to be their magnum opus, I would say myself included at this point, Like Clockwork. And this was the album that essentially ushered in the band's new modern era. Throughout the 2000s and even the late 90s, the band had this very gritty hard rock style with some metal influence here and there, even sprinkled out, a very stoner rock type appeal. It was just a lot more hard hitting. And since Like Clockwork, and including that album itself, it's been a more emotional side of the band and a more melodic side for all of the instrumentals and everything accompanying. That's not to say there isn't any hard-hitting moments, but most of it is more of an emotional crescendo, something very theatrical. The other landmark moment in the band's history that Like Clockwork ushered in is the start of a trilogy. Since that album, we have gotten one more called Villains, and now In Times New Roman. In Times New Roman being the close of this trilogy. It has been an entire 9 years that this whole trilogy has been spanning. 6 years since Villains, so this is somewhat of a comeback album as well, which is cool. As far as the sound and instrumentation goes, if you are a fan of Queens of the Stone Age and have been for quite a while, at least since Like Clockwork, you're not going to be incredibly surprised by what you're going to hear on In Times New Roman. I feel like, in a way, this is more of a combination of all of their music before this point. So it has some of the edgier style of the early albums, such as Rated R, Songs for the Deaf, things like that, which are masterpieces in their own right, and mixing that with the more theatrical and emotional side that I was already speaking on. Most of the drama and theatrics of this particular release is actually more coming from Homme's vocals themselves. He's still far from reverting to his earlier gravelier tone, and I would say this album actually shows his smoothest crooning yet. It's to the point that it actually took me a little while to warm up to it. When I first played this album, I honestly didn't like it much, especially his vocals. The smoothness of it doesn't really immediately match the tone that the instrumental is taking, and I think that there's a bit less punch to his vocals on this album, but it is something that you come to appreciate on multiple listens. I would say that it does actually give a more unique feel to the album itself. As much as I wouldn't like to mention it, I do feel like I have to point out the one negative side to this album's sound, that being the mixing and production on certain tracks. If I were to pick apart and dismiss any element of it whatsoever, it would definitely be that, just because things sound a bit off. There's either too much separation between instruments, which can be a good thing in the right context, but here it just makes it feel like things are a bit disjointed from time to time, or there's a severe lack of loudness on things like the guitars and especially the drums, which I find pretty odd because they are known for especially some louder guitar tones. Everything sounds all right, but the textures are just a bit inoffensive. I can, however, appreciate the fact that the mixing does at times contribute to the album's overall aesthetics. A notably dark and gloomy mood is probably the most interesting thing they're bringing to the table on In Times New Roman, and it does in a way enhance that. It matches the cover very much so in how it sounds, with this very surreal but still dark and gritty picture that we see here. It does very little to match the comic book-like stylings of the last two album covers, and I think the sound reflects that as well, just because this is a little bit less upbeat and a little bit more maybe in a realistic tone. Even when the songs themselves aren't as gloomy, there's kind of this looming edginess that floats over the sound. It's like a thick tar coating the whole album. I think I've kind of done a lot of comparing to the previous two records, and I feel like it's only right to, being the closer to a trilogy, but on its own, it is rock just done pretty well. If we were to entirely piece out and give the depth that this album's lyrics may actually contain, it would take a lot of analysis of the last two albums' lyrics. There is direct callbacks, specific mentions and references of other lyrics that were on those previous two albums, as well as just recurring themes. The song Made to Parade specifically does drive that point home. But even if we are to close in a little bit more specifically and only look at In Times New Roman, there's a pretty diverse set of themes. We may have seen the most personal and introspective rendition of Josh Homme's writing on the last decade of their work, because on In Times New Roman, there is some of that present from song to song, but there are also plenty of songs that take a more outward and less introspective tone and style, and it provides a little bit of commentary at times as well. From what I understand, Josh Homme went through a divorce before the creation of this album and kind of in the middle of the trilogy itself. Songs like Paper Machete and Emotion Sickness do seem to be giving us a little bit of a taste of those harsh emotions that could come along with such a life event. Another more personal and introspective track is Negative Space, in which he had this to say. When things do look a little bit more outward, I think we have some of the most potent and poignant moments, with a overall critique of capitalism and the modern society that comes along with it seeming to be one of the biggest points they're trying to drive home here. Straight Jacket Fitting and Made to Parade are both great examples of that. And then there's also What the Peephole Say, excellent title by the way, but this seems to be somewhat of a critique on the public school system, if we want to dig a little bit into it. Otherwise, it may just be a song about being a rebellious teenager and not wanting to go to school. It seems like it's somewhere in between those. There is specific mention of schools, though, that seems very interesting. You'd have to dig into it a little bit more to gain your own interpretation, which is something nice here. I think overall you could get your own perspective and interpret your own meanings from this album's lyrics. And there is overall just a sentiment of rising up against the power, whether it be something more specific like that or just an overall distrust and disliking of those in power. In Times New Roman does seem to be calling for an uprising. A variety of themes and subjects isn't necessarily a bad thing. However, I do think that it can dislodge the flow of a project depending on how it's executed, and I think there's a little bit of both on In Times New Roman. But there is a consistent enough set of sounds that it doesn't seem like it's going to dislodge your enjoyment or bring you out of the experience if you're not paying very close attention to the writing and if that's not the only thing you're focusing on. In Times New Roman reads very little like a concept album or anything where they set out with a specific message to drive home with each song. However, if we are to look at the callbacks to the previous trilogy entries, it does form somewhat of a concept if we wanted to connect all the webs here. To the average listener, however, who isn't going to obsess over it, there is a lot of ground covered, and most of it is covered pretty poetically and very well done lyrically. Picking out some favorites isn't hard to do. There are quotables stacked all over the album itself. For starters, comparing a person to a paper machete is really clever comparison. On one hand, it means the person is menacing outwardly, but in reality is flimsy and fake. A possible double meaning is that a paper machete could give you a paper cut. A paper cut is painful and annoying, but is very unlikely to cause any real damage, further solidifying that this person's actions hold no real threat yet, but aren't accepted welcomely. The entire third verse of Time and Place is just clever in the right way, even if it may be a bit lowbrow in its sexual tone. The cigarette metaphor really drives home certain points solidly. For something a bit more meaningful, look no further than Made for Parade, where Hami sings the line, "I did not notice the weight of the chains until they were cut from me. How did I drag them for so long?" It reminds me a lot of the Bye Bye Black Balloons line on Collapsia. A final specific nod has to be given in the direction of Motion Sickness, where the line, "Then my fever broke," is repeated several times throughout the song. The elaboration upon the sickness that is the emotion sickness is quite clever by saying that a fever is breaking, being compared to the coming of a realization. Call this cheating if you'd like, but the entirety of Straight Jacket Fitting is also just so damn epic that it feels like a shame not to mention it. On to the track-by-track section of the segment here. The first track on here is Obscenery. Obscenery is obviously the opening cut of the album, and I do like it at this point, but it made me worried that I was not going to like the album. It doesn't serve very well as an opener, but it has grown on me massively in the time that I've been listening to this album and writing for this video. I've found a lot to appreciate about it. The flow is somewhat obtuse, with the verse-chorus structure not being as clear-cut as you would expect for something of this nature. The lyrics are also very hard to pull a specific meaning from. It almost seems like they're intentionally ridiculous at times, but this is one of the more abstract moments of writing. It's riddled with innuendo, but also seems to be commenting on the chaos around the narrator, whether it be in their personal life or society at large, I'm not sure. The vocal tone in which these lyrics are delivered is a little bit off-putting, like I mentioned before, at least on first listen. This is probably the most jarring performance that he has, so it's odd to put it first. However, 10 plus listens in, I've grown to love it. Track 2 is Paper Machete. I love Paper Machete. I liked it a lot on my first listen, which I can't necessarily say about most of the other songs, and at this point, it's just one of my favorite songs of the year. The fast-paced nature of this one make it instantly likable, and what improves that likability is the catchy hook and the very well-made solo. And the song itself is very well written, which is something I've already specifically mentioned, so I won't get too far into it, but I think the primary metaphor at the very least is something really great. The only thing negative of note is that it does bring in that kind of wacky mixing. Track 3, Negative Space, is a somewhat jarring transition from track 2, although on its own it is pretty great. But its predecessor is one of the fastest and most intense on the album, whereas this is one of the slowest, most melodic and emotional. The moody tone of the song does match very well with the lyrical content, which again we've already kind of gotten into. This track has one of the thickest and most gloomy atmospheres, and I do wish there was a little bit more of a strong hook or a strong structure overall. That is something that I do come to Queens of the Stone Age for. However, I just have to appreciate the aesthetic it takes up, and the fact that it matches so well with the lyricist. Time and Place is a pretty simple one, although it's clearly a standout, especially given that plucky melody that goes throughout the entire track. This is also one of the most odd on the track list, even in its simplicity, and Hami's vocals just have this indescribable swagger to them. The flow of this one is so smooth. The nocturnal angle that it takes up is something I really enjoy about it. Made to Parade is a song that I've mentioned several times and was instantaneously my favorite on the album and still remains to be one of my favorites on the album. We've already talked about the lyrics quite a bit, but I have to mention again just how well written this whole song is overall, and just the fact that it sounds like the soundtrack for a revolution. The sound of the song does also match very well, especially with that parading theme given in the title. It's just so steady, and the whole thing seems to have this marching band-like quality to it. It's got this big, steady riff to it, and it builds to a place that thankfully feels more epic than it does bland. This is the most dramatic and theatrical the album gets, and I would say that it's a wonderful peak to sit at. There are several distinct sections that each offer up something very interesting. Track 6, also fantastic title, Carnavoyeur, seems to also be approaching with a somewhat slow and steady wins the race. This one also has a big riff that's making the whole track trudge on heavily. It seems they were carrying on with the marching motif, and I think that this one also builds to a pretty satisfying place. Track 7 is What the Peephole Say. As we mentioned before, the lyricism on this one at least seems to be giving the ethos of rise against the power, and as would make sense with that sentiment, this is the most punk feeling Queens of the Stone Age song that I've heard from this trilogy, and even from a lot of their earlier work. Even though there's more glamour to it and more polish to it than your average punk song, the fast-paced nature of it and catchy chorus do instantly bring the genre to mind. This is one of the most objectively fun ones on the album, and I could easily see it making its way into commercials or parties or the radio. I find it very odd that this didn't end up being a promotional single, because it seems like the obvious answer. I would theorize that it will become a single in the future, although I don't know if they plan to. Everything about Sicily, track 8, is big, heavy, and dense. The entire song seems to be mixed in the low end. It's all bass, and that bass is hard and heavy. This fits in the same realm as What the Peephole Say, and if we wanted to say that this was in a movie or for a movie trailer, this one, instead of being the theme for the protagonist, is the ominous and dark theme for the villain. There's very little that I can do to describe the ominous, dark nature of the song just looming overhead, but it's incredible. Emotion Sickness is track 9, also the lead single, oddly, and I do think that it's the most familiar sounding. For better or for worse, if you're a consumer of modern rock, you are going to hear some things on Emotion Sickness that are very close to what you would normally hear. The verse-chorus sectioning, the hook itself, the riffs, all will make you feel right at home. It's tried and true, but it's also probably the least innovative of the songs here. Even lyrically, it seems to have fairly generic themes, although they are well written. I would call it less derivative and more tried and true, although it just doesn't end up being one of the more memorable ones for me personally. But if you are a fan of the style, which I assume you would be coming to this album, it'll probably be the one for you. Straight Jacket Fitting is our 10th and final track on the album. It feels like a fitting part 2 to what we got halfway through the album with Made to Parade. It is a damn good closer and wraps up, I would say, half of the album's overall themes, with the less emotional side not really being touched on here, but the social commentary or more political side of this album with the approach of certain tracks is certainly wrapped up here, and it feels like such a epic moment to close on, especially given that this is the final track of the entire trilogy. They really nailed it, and I was worried that this album would go out with a whimper rather than a bang, but it really goes out with a bang. I mean, come on, the middle 8 section in this song, one of the craziest moments on a Queens of the Stone Age song that I have heard in a long time. I respect the ambition overall, and I think it's also interesting that they opted to do the 2-minute instrumental section at the very end of this, but it feels like the whole trilogy is parading its way on out, which is very fitting. In Times New Roman is the end of an era for Queens of the Stone Age, and it's very interesting to think of what they might do next. Usually when we speak on an era, we aren't speaking on an over-decade-long time period. However, that's what we're at here. We've had the same members for this 10 years, and this is the closing of an official canon trilogy. And this trilogy ends pretty well. This is a very fun listen overall. While it's not as highbrow and doesn't have the theatrical peaks of something like Clockwork, it hits a nice balance and brings us a little bit of everything that they've produced so far and presents most of it pretty nicely to us. This album is heavy and dark in certain spots, but it's not all switchblades and cigarettes either, as we do see a little bit more of a glamorous aesthetic in certain moments, and I believe I've essentially riffed on this idea many times throughout this entire recording. So to not overuse this. I want to just make that absolutely clear. It's awesome that 8 albums in, Josh Homme, and 3 albums in at least for the rest of the members, they're still having plenty interesting ideas to offer up to us. They've got gas left in the tank for more interesting ideas still. The best recommendation I can give to you is to hop on the highway, put your pedal to the floor, turn this up loud, and just soak in all the sounds. So that about wraps it up. I'm realizing that this structure is a lot longer than I thought it was, so I might cut certain parts of this, but it may just be like a 25 to 30 minute long video. I don't mind. This was very fun to record, and I hope you guys are enjoying this segment as it continues to come out. It is what I'm going to be sticking to, but that being said, if you have any suggestions for me on how this series could be improved, or if you would like to recommend albums of the day, that would be great. This is not necessarily the best starting point. I just thought it was very fitting for the channel itself, but in the future I am shooting for things that are a little bit more underground, underappreciated, possibly at the very least. I want to dig in for deep cuts to point out to you guys. So if there's some underground stuff that really hits for you, let me know, and if it hits for me, then it'll end up on here eventually. I hope you all enjoyed, and that's about it. I will see you in the next video. First of all, like I said before, thank you so much for sticking around through this very long period of time where I've barely been uploading. This was never really my intention. I realized during 2020 especially, I was just very consistent with the uploads, but don't sign up for jobs that you hate. I'll just leave it at that. Or don't stay at a job you hate. There's other stuff out there. I mean, it's not worth it. Second thing I want to note, Yeti mic in the hand, obviously not ideal. I am completely aware of that. However, I can't find the stand that came with it, and my big stand is a massive pain in my ass. So we're just going stand-up comedian style with it. The next thing I do want to mention is that although this is obviously going to occupy most of the space on the channel, we have big videos coming, like big essay style sort of things, just little things like vinyl things as well. You know, probably going to do a collection video pretty soon here, just because I love doing that. I mean, showing off the actual pressings themselves and the artwork and stuff is cool, as well as getting to talk about some of my favorites. So that'll probably be coming up soon. Reaction content is not totally off the table. It's just not going to be like an everyday thing. One thing that I did notice in those very infrequent uploads is that it just eats up too much of my time to do the crazy editing and everything, and I want something a little bit more original as well. But those probably will still be coming back. I mean, you know, I really do thank you all who may have stuck around this long for sticking around. So that's great. But we're going to move back on. Well, I guess at this point you've seen the whole video. Also, do want to mention how poetic that Queens of the Stone Age titled an album in Times New Roman after I started writing all of the updates and like channel posts in Times New Roman. It became the aesthetic here, like very briefly, like not frequently, I should say anyways. And then immediately this album gets announced, and I think that's really interesting, just an odd little coincidence, especially given how much of a staple Queens of the Stone Age was in the past. But if you skipped here, let's get back to the video. If you watch the whole thing, thank you for watching, as I already said.